Good evening. It's good to see each of you here this evening. I'm glad that you're here. And so, what did we talk about on Monday night? You remember? What did we talk about Monday night? Not a trick question. What did we talk about on Monday night? 1 Kings chapter 17 and verse number 1, there was a drought. How was Elijah going to survive the drought? God provided for him. He provided for him in, of course, several ways. He told him to go to the brook. How else did he provide for him? The ravens would bring him food. And then there was really one other way that God provided. The widow, that's right. Remember, he would see the widow, and of course, she would provide for him. Tuesday night, we talked about, well, what did we talk about? I don't want to give it away. What did we talk about Tuesday night? 1 Kings chapter 18, the first part of that chapter. The contest on Mount Carmel. And so we had, of course, Elijah representing Jehovah. We had, of course, the prophets of Baal. And at the beginning of that, you remember Elijah had asked the people a question: how long stand ye halt between two opinions? If Jehovah be God, serve him. If Baal be God, serve him. And the people answered him not a word. But of course, by the end of that conflict, all of Israel was saying, Jehovah, he is God. Jehovah, he is God. And so the people acknowledged that. What did we talk about last night? Man, I know we slept, but prayer, that's right. The end of the drought was going to come, and so Elijah, of course, he would send his servant to look out, and 7 times the servant came, and on that 7th time, you remember, he had found the little cloud, and of course, that cloud turned into a big storm. And so we talked about the power of prayer. What we're going to do tonight, there's really going to be 2 aspects of our lesson, but we're really going to just try and keep it. I'm really going to focus on the first part. And so if you want to maybe take notes and read this later, we've got 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 19, and that's going to be our primary focus for tonight in our lesson. And then the second half, which I'm sure the kids will talk about, so I'll ask them some questions about it when they come back up, but we may not actually get there in our class, is 2 Kings chapter number 2, verses 1 through 14. Now, just in case we don't get to 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 14, that is where Elijah is going to be taken up into heaven in that whirlwind of fire. And so that does happen. And of course, when that happens, Elisha will take over as really the main prophet of God during this time. And so I don't know if we'll necessarily get to that aspect of our study, but at least you understand why maybe the kids will be talking about it, because that will be inclusive of the study this evening. But what I want us to focus on for the majority of our study is really going to be the events that happen in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 1 through 19. And what I want to do, and I've gone back and forth with how I wanted to tackle this material. You know, I love the books that we have. Don't misunderstand me. I think a lot of the material in the books has been really good. The particular lesson in the adult book for tonight, I didn't really much care for, and so I've kind of taken from it. But really, I've got the majority of my own stuff. I will reference the book on a couple of instances, but I just really didn't care for a lot of the material that they used. But that's not a slight on them. I just want you to know that, the stuff, like last night, we dealt with things that were specifically in the book, and we kind of went a lot along with the book. And so tonight, we're going to kind of get away from that book. So what I want to do is I want to read these 19 verses. And so if you'll bear with me, we'll read them. That way we kind of understand what is going on, what's happening to Elijah. And then we're going to go back and we're going to talk about these things. And ultimately, by the time we get to the end of it, Lord willing, we'll be able to make some New Testament application. So starting there in verse number 1, And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, and withal how he had slain all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger unto Elijah, saying, So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I make not thy life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. And when he had saw that, he arose and went for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongeth to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a juniper tree. And he requested for himself that he might die, and said, It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than my fathers. And as he lay and slept under a juniper tree, behold, the angel touched him, and said unto him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was a cake and bacon on the coals, and a cruse of water at his head. And he did eat and drink, and laid him down again. And the angel of the Lord came again the second time, and touched him, and said, Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for thee. And he arose and did eat and drink, and went in the strength of that meat 40 days and 40 nights unto Horeb, the mount of God. And he came thither unto a cave, and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said unto him, What doest thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, Go forth and stand upon the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind rent the mountains, and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And it was so, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle, and he went out and stood in the entering of a cave. And behold, there came a voice unto him, and said, What doest thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord God of hosts, because the children of Israel has forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altar, slain thy prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And the Lord said unto him, Go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abimelech shalt thou anoint to be the prophet in thy room. And it shall come to pass that him that escapeth the sword of Hazael shall Jehu slay, and him that escapeth from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha slay. Yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him. So he departed thence, and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was plying with 12 yoke of oxen before him. And he with the 12, and Elijah passed by him, and cast his mantle upon him, through verse number 19. And so what we're going to look at this evening is we're going to look at Elijah, and we're going to talk about where he was, where he ends up, and ultimately where he, I guess we could say going, but where he, I'm going to say, returns to. And so you think about Elijah here for a moment. You think about even everything that we've talked about this week, how God was able to sustain him with ravens, how God was able to sustain him with the widow. It's pretty amazing to be able to witness the power of God, a story that we did not cover in our VBS, but there the widow that sustained him, you keep on reading, her son would die, and what was Elijah with God able to do? Resurrect that son. And so we see the power then that God has. And then, of course, you get into Mount Carmel, and you see the victory that Jehovah has there, the victory that Elijah witnesses, the victory that Elijah prayed for. And then you move on down, and Elijah prays for the rain to return. And so God fulfills that. And so you might say that Elijah, man, things are going great for him. But as you see there in chapter 19, verses 1 and 2, after a conversation with Jezebel, Elijah's demeanor, attitude, and very thoughts change. And so here Elijah was, he has this conversation, and then I did take this point from the book. He really, when you look at it, he went into isolation. Now, we see that he went into isolation because you move down to verse number 3 of chapter 19, where it says that he had went to Beersheba, which belonged to Judah, and he left his servant there. Now, there was an entire page in the book that was dedicated as to why Elijah left his servant there. The simple answer is we don't know. For whatever reason, Elijah left his servant. The Bible does not tell us as to the why, but he leaves his servant. Verse 4, he goes himself into the wilderness, and sadly, this is the attitude that Elijah ends up with. He sits down under this juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die. As a matter of fact, he even asked God. He says, "Oh Lord, take away my life, for I am not better than the fathers." And so here you have Elijah, who everything is going well. And understandably, Jezebel threatens him, but instead of relying on all the information that he already had about God, he goes into isolation. Now, here's the thing about isolation. Isolation is one of those things that it can be good, but it can also be bad. I want to show you some instances where isolation is actually good. So maybe put a marker here in 1 Kings chapter number 19, because we're going to come back to it. But look over at Galatians chapter number 1. Galatians chapter number 1. And let's start in verse number 15. Paul writing here to the church of Galatia, he says, "But when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen, immediately I conferred not with flesh and blood. Neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia and returned again unto Damascus. Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him 15 days. And so Paul is telling the church of Galatia, he says, listen, when I obeyed the gospel, I did not immediately go to Jerusalem. No, he said, I actually went into the wilderness. And he says that he was there for 3 years. And so I think about this. I understand, and I believe that you do too, that Paul, he was inspired of the Holy Spirit. Did he need to take 3 years to be able to study the Word of God, to know what it was that he was going to say? No, he didn't have to take 3 years, because we already know, according to Philippians chapter number 3, that as far as being a Jew pertaining to the old law, he's saying, listen, I was top notch. We know that he sat at the feet of Gamaliel. So he knew the Old Testament scriptures. He's going to be inspired of the Holy Spirit. And so the Holy Spirit would tell him the things that he needed to do. But he still took 3 years to go into Arabia and to spend there and to meditate on spiritual things. Sometimes isolation can be good for us, as far as our spiritual growth is concerned. Now, I'm not saying you need to take 3 years and go sit in your closet by yourself and do nothing. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying sometimes, even when we do our own personal Bible study, sometimes it's best to do it alone. You come to the house and my office is downstairs, and I'll sit there and be studying, but sometimes the kids will come through and they'll be hooping and hollering and doing whatever. And you know what? It's a lot harder to focus on study when those things are going on. And so sometimes our own spiritual growth, our own Bible study is better when we're by ourselves. Look over at Matthew chapter 14. I want to show you another instance where we see that isolation within itself is not necessarily a bad thing. Look at Matthew chapter number 14, and let's look at let's just look at verse 23. Matthew chapter 14, verse number 23, it says, "And when he," talking about Jesus, "had sent the multitudes away, he went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone." So here we have an example of Jesus, and he goes by himself. And what's he doing? He's praying. Sometimes when we have things that are in our mind, that are on our mind, things that we are wanting to communicate to the Father, sometimes it's best to have those private moments alone. Just us and God. We even looked at last night there in Matthew chapter number 6, there and about verse number 5, a little bit further down than that, where Jesus was saying, listen, don't be like these people out here who are out praying in the streets, but when you say your prayer, go into a closet and say it there. Not that he was saying you have to be in a closet every time that you pray, but that prayer, that private prayer, that's between you and God. And having that time alone to yourself, that can help an individual's prayer life. Let's look at another one. Look over at Mark chapter number 6. Mark chapter number 6, and let's look at verses 31 to 32. Mark chapter 6. Verses 31 and 32. "And he said unto them, Come ye yourselves apart unto a desert place, and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat. And they departed into a desert place by ship privately." So here Jesus is talking to his apostles, verse number 30, and he says, listen, you need to take time to separate yourselves to rest and recharge. Now, would Jesus, because Jesus has been involved in the Matthew account and the Mark account, of course it was Paul that was writing to the church at Galatia, but would Jesus, or for Paul that matter, would they instruct individuals to do things that were harmful to themselves? The answer is no. And so there are certainly times when being by ourselves is not a bad thing. There are certainly times when being by ourselves, sometimes it can be helpful. Sometimes it can be refreshing. Sometimes it can be recharging. Sometimes you just need that moment to get alone, to get away. Sometimes I'll be talking with Sarah, right, when maybe I've been out of the house all day and she's been stuck at home all day with all the 3 girls. Now, don't misunderstand me. Our girls are somewhat angels. But sometimes Sarah will just say, Zach, I just need a moment to breathe. I get that. Go take your 5 minutes, recharge, do whatever. I got the kids for 5-10 minutes, however long it needs to be. And so sometimes isolation, it can be a good thing for us. Now, as we're going to see, though, in the case of Elijah, sometimes isolation can be bad. Sometimes isolation can provide opportunities for Satan. Look over at, I've got two passages here. I want to start in the New Testament, though, and I'll give you the Old Testament reference, and you can go look at it. We probably, just for time's sake, won't look at it. Look over at Matthew chapter number 4. And you know this account really well. Matthew chapter number 4. And you look there at verse number 1. Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterward he was a hunger. And when the tempter came to him, he said, If thou be the Son of God, command these stones be made of bread. Now, what I am presenting to you, the idea is when Jesus was in the wilderness, was he by himself or was he with a group of people? He was by himself. The Old Testament account that I have in mind, that I have written down here, is in Genesis chapter number 3. Eve finds herself alone in the garden, and who is there? The tempter. Sometimes when we are by ourselves, that can open the door for the tempter. There are things that people will do in the privacy of their own home, in the privacy of their own bedroom, that they would blush at if it was done out in the open. Now, I realize that we're moving to a society, as Jeremiah would say, that the people are forgetting how to blush. But I submit to you, there are still people that somehow have this idea that when they're at home alone by themselves, that they really think they're by themselves. They forget that God's really there. But they're willing to do things. Well, they're alone. They're isolated. And Satan can use those times to bring about temptation. Go over to the book of Ecclesiastes. Let's look at another one. And if any time you have a comment or question, just work your way in here. I'm just going to go through some of these that I have written down here. Ecclesiastes chapter number 4. I tell you what, somebody read verses 9 to 12 for me. Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through 12.
Him who is alone when he falls, for he has no one to help him up. Again, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? Though one may be overpowered by another, two can withstand him. And a threefold cord is not quickly broken.
Do you see what Solomon is promoted in these verses? Solomon's saying, hey, it's better to be with individuals. And so when we revert to being in isolation, you think about some of the things here that Solomon says. You know, it's two are better than one because they have a good reward for if they fall, one will lift up his fellow, but woe to him that falls alone. Why? Because he doesn't have another one to pick him up. And so when we put ourselves in isolation, we are taking away the opportunity that someone might have to be able to assist us. And so again, isolation can be good, but if we're not careful, it can put us in situations where it's probably better not to be. Also consider, let's catch the Proverbs passage here. Proverbs 18, verse 24. Proverbs 18 and verse number 24. A man that hath friends must show himself friendly, and there is a friend that sticketh closer to a brother. Now, let's look at, with that, Romans chapter 12 and verse number 15. Romans chapter 12 and verse number 15. Rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep. I cannot rejoice with someone or weep with someone if I am in isolation. No one can rejoice with me or weep with me if I have isolated myself. And so again, isolation, it can be good or bad. I would suggest, and take this for what you will, I'll give you a Zach Hall opinion for just a moment, and it's not worth a whole lot. But if you're going to take time to be by yourself, take that time. But I would encourage you not to be forever in that time, if that makes sense. Take time to be with those that care about you.
There was a brother at another congregation. He was, I guess he's still alive. I don't know. He was in his 80s. After his wife died, he started being a hermit, literally went in his house. And so the brother was trying to visit with him. He wrote a letter to the congregation that basically said, leave me alone. And that's another danger of being alone. We think we don't need anybody else. And what's really, I mean, there's a lot of things about it that's very scary, but in his mind, he's still perfectly fine in the eyes of God. Loneliness, or being alone, so being alone can be very deceiving.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you think about that and you use the word alone, and this how show you sporadic my brain is sometimes. I didn't connect all of this until just now. In Genesis, when all the animals come before Adam and he's naming them, but he could not find a helpmeet that was compatible for him, what did God say about that situation? It is not good for man to be alone. And so even God understood, okay, it's okay for Adam to be alone for a little bit, but we need to get him his helper. We need to get him his help meet. And man, we are not moving through this material very quickly at all. All right, so now let's get back to Elijah. Since we spent a little time dealing with isolation, I want to get back to the story of Elijah. So go back to 1 Kings chapter number 19. And we can tell by the context as we're reading here in 1 Kings chapter 19 that Elijah's isolation was clearly not a good thing. In my mind, nothing proves that point further than in verse number 4, when he literally sits down and his prayer to God is, kill me. Now, I've been in some pretty rough situations. I remember when I was out living the life of a heathen and doing I'm just honest with you, I was doing ungodly things. And because I was doing ungodly things, man, my life was pretty terrible. But you know what? Even in the midst of all that, I don't ever remember asking God, just take me now. Just kill me. I don't. And so that's where Elijah has gotten. Now, notice a few other things. Not only is he saying this prayer in verse number 5, but we see in verse number 4, but you look at verses 5 and 7, he's not eating. He's not drinking, because God has to send an angel to wake Elijah up and tell him, he says, listen, behold, there was a cake baking on coals, verse 6, and a cruse of water at his head, and he did eat and drink and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again the second time and touched him and said, arise and eat, because thy journey is too great for thee. Now, here's what's interesting. Elijah still got some things that he has to do. Verse 8 says he's going to arise, and he ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that meat for 40 days and 40 nights. And so Elijah's getting ready to do some wandering for 40 days and 40 nights. But this angel from God, after he wakes him up the second time and tells him, Elijah, you need to eat and drink, because if you don't, you're not going to make it. You physically will not make it if you do not eat and drink. And so we see the attitude of Elijah. We see him not eating, and we see him not sleeping. Now, I thought this was interesting. If you'll allow me just to read this paragraph. It says, Elijah's state of health, feeling all alone, would be described by mental health professionals today as a major depressive episode. Elijah felt discouraged and overwhelmed. He felt that life was not worth living. He apparently tried he was apparently tired and seems to have very little appetite. He did not want to be around other people. He did not want to do the things that he had previously enjoyed, but just sat around doing nothing. According to the American Psychiatric, there we go, Association, these are all the symptoms of depression. And so what we have here, because Elijah went into this isolation, that he went from not only just being alone, he went to now he's depressed. And one of the beautiful things that we're going to see is that Elijah is depressed. God, who knows all things, recognizes this, and he starts to provide some things for Elijah that's going to help him.
It's a good reminder that most things start with the mind. His depression led to physical acts, physical decisions. Because he was depressed, he decayed. Because he remained depressed, he stayed decayed. And we find examples of that, I think, throughout the Bible, where individuals feel like they're downtrodden, as the psalmist talks about, is because their mental state, so to speak. But of course, no one's better encouragement than God.
That's right. And I've been thinking about this, and we're going to deal with Elijah, but I want to make this point here before Steve rings that other bell. Give me just, because he's getting up to ring it right now. I want to make this point before we go have our cookies. So just bear with me just a second. Actually, no, I don't have enough time to make the point. Just ring the bell, Steve. When we come back up, because I don't want to cut your time short downstairs. And so when we come back upstairs, I want to make a point from 2 Timothy. Now, I don't have 2 Timothy in my notes, and so if I start on something else, someone reminded me, hey, Zach, you wanted to make a point out of 2 Timothy, and we'll get to it. All right, go enjoy a cookie. All righty, we're going to go ahead and continue on. I want to make a point from 2 Timothy, and before class had dismissed, we were talking that sometimes the actions we take can lead to depression and other things of that nature. And sometimes, and I think even in the case of Elijah, sometimes we forget about everything that God has done for us, everything that God continues to do for us. And so look over at 2 Timothy chapter number 4. Now, I want to say this from the onset. I am not saying that Paul was depressed, but I want you to notice something as he writes here to Timothy. In 2 Timothy chapter number 4, he acknowledges there in verse number 6 through about verse number 8 that his physical life, is getting ready to come to an end. And he acknowledges that. And so he tells Timothy in verse number 9, do thy diligence to come shortly unto me, or come quickly. The reason, Timothy, I want you to come quickly, verse number 10, for Demas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, is departed unto Thessalonica, Cretans to Galatia, Titus unto Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry. And Tychicus have I sent to Ephesus. The cloak that I left at Troas with Carpus, when thou comest, bring with thee, and the book, but especially the parchment. Alexander the coppersmith did me much evil. The Lord reward him according to his works, of whom he be thou ware also, for he hath greatly withstood our words. At my first answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsake me. I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge. Now stop right there at verse number 16 for just a moment and think about everything that Paul has told Timothy from verse number 9 all the way to verse number 16, that he's been abandoned. Some people have left for other works. Some people have left because they love the present world. Some people there are doing harm to him, such as this Alexander the coppersmith. And on top of all of this, Paul is in prison. And he says there at verse number 16, he said, At my first answer, no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. Now, if we stop right there, what does the mindset of Paul look like? Certainly can say that he looks discouraged. He doesn't have a very bright outlook on things. Now, here is the difference I submit to you between the Apostle Paul and Elijah. And I'm not condemning Elijah, because Elijah is going to turn things around, and we're going to look at that. But notice what Paul goes on to say in verse number 17. He said, notwithstanding the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, that by me the preaching might be fully known, that all Gentiles might hear, and I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. And so Paul's saying, listen, I've been forsaken by all men. And even though all men had forsaken him, and he felt maybe that he was there alone, who did he rely on? Who did he put his trust in? He put his trust in God. And that's one of the things that we see Elijah is not doing. And I say he's not doing that because of verse number 4, right? When he's there saying, Lord, just go ahead and kill me. He's not eating. He's not drinking. We also read that, after he gets fed and gets watered, he comes to a cave, verse 9. He lodges there, so he's still in isolation. The word of the Lord comes to him, and God asks Elijah a question. Questions are very, especially when God asks the question, right? If I may ask Russ, like, Russ, what are you doing here? And his response may be, well, I was just hoping to see you do the hippopotamus song again so you could look silly. It's a question, and then a response is given, but I don't necessarily know the response before Russ gives it. Russ could give any answer. But when God asks a question, does he already know what it is he's asking? The example that I always give, and I guarantee you probably everyone in this room has heard me say this before, but in Genesis, when God asked Adam, where art thou, Adam? Did God just all of a sudden lose Adam? No. What's he doing? Adam, you need to think about what you're doing. Elijah, God knows exactly why Elijah's in that cave. Elijah, do you know why you're in this cave? Elijah, you need to think about why you are in this cave. And so what we're going to see is God addressing the needs of Elijah. And I skipped over this point, but I didn't really skip over this point. As far as God providing help, providing the needs that Elijah has, the first thing that he does is he feeds Elijah. He gives them something to drink. Okay, Elijah, you're isolated. You're going through depression. You're not eating. You're not drinking. We need to make sure that you eat something. We need to make sure you drink something. So God sends that angel, and he fulfills that need. He asks Elijah, why are you here? Now, Elijah gives a very interesting response. He said, I have been very jealous. Probably a better understanding of that word, zealous. Zealous for the Lord God of hosts. For the children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thy altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And so God says, Elijah, why are you here? Elijah's response, well, God, I've been very zealous for you. I've done a lot of good things for you. Your people, the children of Israel, they've thrown down your altar. They've killed all the other prophets. And now, God, they're seeking to kill my life. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm hiding in this cave. Now, Elijah is thinking about himself, and he's not thinking about God. And so what God does next, in my mind, is very interesting, because he wants to encourage Elijah. He wants to really jumpstart Elijah's thinking into remember who's in control. Because sometimes, if we're not careful, we start to play this pity party and we forget what things are really about, right? I remember, what was it? Was it last fall? before we had our gospel meeting, a couple groups of us went out and we knocked doors. And one of the things that we discussed before we did that was, don't get what I call Samuel syndrome. Now, I get that from 1 Samuel chapter number 8. And you remember the people came to Samuel in 1 Samuel chapter number 8, and they said, hey, Samuel, you're getting old. Your children, they're not very righteous. And so, Samuel, we want you to make us a king. And how did Samuel take that news? Wasn't very happy, right? He prays to God, and he makes, he's talking about God. Your people have forsaken, that they want this king. And you remember what God tells Samuel? Samuel, give the people all that they asked for. They haven't rejected you, but they've rejected me. They've rejected God. And so here, God is trying to remind Elijah that, Elijah, I'm still God. I'm still in control. It doesn't matter what the children of Israel are going to do. And, Elijah has this mindset that he's all alone. He feels like he's the only one remaining faithful to God. Now, eventually, God is going to show him that line of thinking is incorrect, because he is not the only one that has remained faithful. But before God reveals that information to Elijah, he does something that, in my mind, it's very interesting. When you consider what he does in verses 11 through 13, he tells Elijah, go forth and stand up on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind rent the mountains and brake in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord wasn't in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. In verses 11 through 12 and 13, God is trying to get Elijah to realize that all these things, everything that's going on around you, God is in control. He says, you take this wind. God is not in the wind, but he's in control of the wind. You take this earthquake. He's not in the earthquake, but he controls the earthquake. You take the fire and all these things. God is not in those things, but he is in control of those things. Elijah, remember everything that you had done. Remember that God is in control. Elijah, you are not alone. Sometimes we have to be reminded that we're not alone. We have to be reminded that there are other brothers and sisters in Christ that are still fighting the same spiritual warfare that you and I are. I remember when I moved to this area, one of the things that was so appealing to this area for me was the sound congregations that was around. Where I came from, there wasn't very many sound congregations around. There really wasn't. And so I longed to be able to go and be not only with a faithful congregation in the area, but have other faithful congregations around. Guys, that is a blessing. If we don't realize how big of a blessing that is, we're missing the point. A preacher, a friend that I have, preaches up in Kennewick, Washington. There's a brother by the name of Casey Rice. He's a real good brother. And then there was another preacher that was there before him. But at that time, and I don't know, I'm assuming it's still true, but in Kennewick, Washington, where this particular congregation is, there is 3 sound congregations of the Lord Church in a 1,500-mile radius. Now think about that. 1,500 miles, and there's 3 congregations of the Lord's church that are faithful. And so to be in an area where there are those of like precious faith that have the same mindset, the same goals, the same desires, that's so important. And that's one of the things that God is actually going to do for Elijah. We're going to notice here in a minute that God is going to tell Elijah, you've got some things that you need to do. As a matter of fact, it's there at the end where he's told to go anoint a prophet. He's told to go anoint a couple of kings. And so, Elijah, you still have work to do, but the prophet that he anoints is Elisha. And so what you're going to do, Elijah, you're going to anoint Elisha to be a prophet, and then Elisha is going to be with you, and you're going to instruct him. In other words, God says, Elijah, it's not good for you to be alone. And so you're going to have Elisha, and Elisha is going to be there, and he's going to help you, and you're going to help him. And then when you leave, then Elisha is going to be able to pick up that mantle, so to speak, and he's going to be able to carry on. And so God is trying to do all these things to understand, to reaffirm in Elijah's mind that, hey, the same God that was in control on Mount Carmel is the same God that's in control now. And, that's the beautiful thought that we have to carry on as we go throughout our Christian life. Because is it not the case that as a Christian, don't you have ups and downs as a Christian? Sometimes, man, things are going really well as a Christian. And then sometimes things maybe don't go so well. And we have to remember that during the highs and during the lows of our Christian life, God is still God. God is in control. He promises to never leave us nor to forsake us. He promises that we can cast all our burdens on him. And so at the end of this illustration, God asked Elijah that question again. At the end of verse number 13, God asked Elijah, "What doest thou here, Elijah?" Now, I find it very interesting that Elijah still hasn't got the point, because he answers the question in the very same way in verse number 14. But notice, God does not give up on Elijah. As a matter of fact, he says, okay, Elijah, if that's the way you feel, you need to understand some things. First of all, you need to go ahead and get out of this wilderness. You need to go to Damascus, and there is work to do. You need to anoint Hazael to be king of Syria. You need to anoint Jehu to be king of Israel. And as we've already mentioned, you need to anoint Elisha to be the next prophet. And just in case you're missing, God, it's interesting. And even Jude deals with this, but sometimes we have to be a little bit more direct with some people than maybe what we are with other people. And, Jude makes mention, some you save with compassion, but others you have to snatch out of the fire. Well, you get to verse number 18, and God's going to be pretty direct with Elijah. He says, "Yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him." And so Elijah, this thought that you're having, that you're the only one left, you're the only one faithful, God says, Elijah, that's wrong. You may feel that way, Elijah, but it's wrong. It's not factual. It's not true. You need to understand that it's just not true. And, I got to thinking about that, because all that God is trying to do, he is trying to, and maybe I'm misreading this, but he's trying to change the way Elijah is thinking. And sometimes when we get into slumps or whatever the case it is, we need to change the way that we're thinking. So there's two passages that really came to my mind, and I'm sure you're probably familiar with both of them. The first one, look over at Romans chapter number 12. And I know you know this passage, but that's where we're going to start. Because sometimes when things just aren't going our way, we just have to change our thinking. And that's what God was trying to get Elijah to do. Elijah, you need to change your thinking. You look at Romans chapter number 12, you start there in verse number 1. "I beseech or beg you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. One of the things that Paul is saying, listen, you can't be conformed to this world, but you need to be transformed. And how are you transformed? By the renewing of your mind. And so you think about just from going to not a Christian to a Christian, what's a basic thing that has to happen? You have to change, right? We sometimes call that repentance, a change of heart, change of mind, change of action. And so Paul is saying, change the way you're thinking. Sometimes when we get down and we're feeling sad and being depressed, sometimes we need to change the way we're thinking. Look at what's going on around us, and can we think about things differently? Come up with a different mindset. What about this one? I think this goes well with it. Look over at Philippians chapter number 4. And I had never considered this verse in this manner until a good brother caused me to think about it. And it really changed my mind on how I look at this particular verse. Now, there's a lot of things that we could get from Philippians chapter number 4. You look at, we'll just point out a few. You look at verse number 6. He says, be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. That first phrase, be careful for nothing. And another way that we could word that? Don't worry. Don't worry about things. So if I'm not going to worry about things, how do I avoid that? Well, I make my requests be made known to God. If I feel like I'm in maybe for a lack of a better term, if I feel like I'm in a spiritual slump, why don't I make that request known to God? Let him know. Go to him in prayer. We talked about the power of prayer last night, because look at verse number 7. And the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. When we truly commit to being a Christian, when we truly focus on God, not only should it change our mind, but the way we think about things changes too. There's a song that we sometimes sing, and it's not in this blue book, but it's in the red book that we sometimes use on singing night. But this world is not my home. Now, I sometimes wonder when people sing that song if they're not singing a lie. And I don't say that to be mean. I don't say that to be spiteful. And I'm not trying to open old wounds here. But do you know what the year 2020 showed me? That this world was a lot of people's homes because they were afraid to leave it. And that was very evident when the government said, well, you can't worship, and congregations just shut their doors. Now, I came in kind of at the tail end, but I'm very proud to say that this congregation, and the entire time that COVID happened, only shut its doors 2 times. And the 2 times that happened, every single man in the congregation that could lead the service had COVID. And we literally could not have a worship service. I'm sure some of the ladies could have came up and worshiped, but the point I'm saying, all the men that led singing and preached at that time, we all had COVID. And we literally could not have service. But that was 2 times during all of that. The congregation that I left, I have no qualms telling you about this. The congregation that I left to come here, there was not even a case in the county where that congregation was, and they closed the doors. It wasn't even a case in the county. And they closed the doors. They could not sing "This World Is Not My Home" because they were concerned about this world. Several years ago, I say several years ago, it's probably spring of 2021. It was the first time that we had Mike Bonner here for a gospel meeting. He said something one night in one of his lessons that I'll never forget. He was talking about being in an airplane and having the confidence of God. And he said, the peace that passes all understanding, having that confidence in God, if that plane starts going down, he said, I'm going up. Think about it. Could you be that at peace with your situation? You can be. When we truly trust God, when we truly recognize who God is, and we start changing the way we think. And so I said all of that to get us to verse number 8 of Philippians chapter number 4, where Paul says, finally, my brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, if there be any praise, think on these things. These things which ye have both learned and received and heard and seen in me, do. And the God of peace shall be with you. Now, I will tell you that I did not go to college. I don't have a college degree. I mean, I did some college. I just never finished. And so I have a high school diploma, and that's about as good as it gets. I mean, I have the certificate they gave me for preaching school, but, that's a good old paperweight. But the point that I'm trying to make is there's a, I don't know if it's a scientific law or I don't know what it is, but it's called the law of displacement. And the only way that I know how to illustrate that is I got my cup up here, and let's just say that it was full of some pretty gross stuff. And so I go and I get some pure water, some bottles of water, and I just start dumping water into this cup. Eventually, all of the bad things that are in that cup are going to be displaced by that which is good. That's what Paul's talking about here in verse number 8. Instead of thinking on things that are negative, instead of thinking on things that would bring about being depressed, think on things that are true. Focus on things that are honest. Focus on things that are pure. Focus on things that are lovely. Focus on those things that are of good report. Focus on those things that have virtue, those things that bring about praise. And notice he even says, think on these things. I think some translations will say meditate on these things. So get rid of the worldly things, if that's what it is. Get rid of the things that are causing you to be depressed or isolated. And focus on the good things of God. And notice where Paul says those things come from. He says the things that you learned, the things that you received, the things that you heard, the things that you've seen in me. And so Paul says the things that are written in this book, those are things that are pure, lovely, honest, true, and all those other things that he says there in verse number 8. And I love what he says in verse number 9 after he says those things that you learned, received, heard, and seen in me. And it just simply says, do. Do those things. And when you do those things, do you see the result? The peace, the God of peace, shall be with you. And so that really brings us into the next point, because not only was God trying to get Elijah to change the way he was thinking, but one of the ways that God facilitated Elijah to be able to change the way that he's thinking, Elijah, you're no longer going to sit here in isolation in a cave. No, it's time to get up and go to work. It's time to get up and do things. We brought up COVID earlier, so I'll make mention of COVID. The first time that I had COVID, I had it twice that I know of, although only one of them was actually diagnosed positive. But there's two that I know for sure that I had, as sure as you could be as far as that was concerned. But that first time that I had it, I literally slept for a day. Like, I woke up, was feeling terrible, went and laid on the couch. I woke up and it was evening, and so I got up, went to the bed, and went back to sleep. And so the next day, I'm like, okay, I literally just slept for a day. I've got to get up and do something. And by getting up and doing something, that helped me along. Sometimes when we get in a slump, when we get down in the dumps, instead of sitting in the dark in our rocking chair by ourselves, get up and do something. I heard a preacher say one time, if you ever start to feel bad about yourself, do something good for someone else. He said you can't feel crummy doing good for someone else. It's pretty good advice. Galatians chapter 6 and verse number 10, do good unto all men. And so sometimes we just need to get up and get to work. And that's what God was telling Elijah to do. Verses 15 through 17. Here, you get up, you go to Damascus, anoint Hazael, anoint Jehu, anoint Elisha. Elijah, you've got stuff to do. And so then I got to thinking about us. We should be busy with the work of the Lord, right? I think about Jesus, not saying that Jesus was depressed. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that. But even as a young boy at 12 years old in Luke chapter number 2, when he's found in the temple, his parents, Mary and Joseph, they're surprised that Jesus is there. And what does Jesus say? Don't you know that I must be about my Father's business? I got to thinking, are we about our Father's business? When things don't seem to be going right, are we about our Father's business? Next time you're feeling a little depressed or sad or whatever the case may be, go read the book of Psalms. There are some beautiful things in that book that can bring encouragement. Go read the book of James. There are some practical, beautiful things in the book of James. Just find something and read it and stay busy, doing the Lord's work. All right, what I want to spend, I guess let me ask this. Any comments or questions on any of that stuff? Elijah being isolated, depressed, and then God really providing a way for Elijah to get back up and going again. Any comments, questions, concerns?
Dad,
Yes, ma'am.
I always, whenever somebody's sad or sick, I always tell them to pray to God and He will help them.
That's right. We talked about that last night, the power of prayer. It can do good. Just take time and pray. So what I want to spend really the remainder of our time on, go over to, I'm going to have some lessons learned maybe at the end, but I want to bring out this. I didn't know if we'd have time for it. And as quickly as that first hour went, which we really only got about 9 minutes or so. Actually, not even that. I think the first bell is going to ring in about 4. Go over to 2 Kings chapter number 2. 2 Kings chapter number 2. And you look there in verse number 1, it came to pass when the Lord would take Elijah into heaven by a whirlwind that Elijah went with Elijah from Gilgal. And so this chapter opens up, and it's going to be that time that Elijah is going to be taken up to heaven. Now, one of the things that I want you to note is that Elijah, he was depressed in 1 Kings chapter 19, and God is providing him assistance and things to do to get him out of that state. And what I want you to focus on, that Elijah goes on and he finishes his godly life in such a way that he does not have to taste physical death. Now, there's one other person in the Old Testament who did not taste physical death. Who was he? Enoch. That's right. That's right. There's going to be another group of people that will not taste death. Who's that? Right. When Christ comes back, those who are alive and remain. And so it's really interesting that in every dispensation of time, you have an example of someone not dying physically. You have Enoch under the patriarchal age. You have Elijah under the Mosaic system. And then whatever Christians are alive, whenever God comes back, they're not going to taste physical death. So that's an interesting point along the way. But you look at you look at the things that go through here, and we don't have time necessarily to go through all these things, but Elijah said unto Elisha, tarry here, I pray thee, for the Lord hath sent me to Bethel. And Elisha saith unto him, as the Lord liveth, as thy soul liveth, I will not leave thee. So they went down to Bethel. And so you see this time and time again. Elijah is saying to Elisha, hey, tarry thee. And Elisha keeps saying, no, I'm not going to leave you. Now, to me, that shows, sometimes one of the things that we can do is we find a good, faithful brother or sister in Christ that can be a mentor to us, and we just hang around them. We spend time with them. Brother Russ is here, and of course, Lisa. I have known Russ and Lisa for a long, long time, like probably back when I was, when I was in high school. That's how long I've known Russ and Lisa, and I love them very much. I always joke with Vanessa because obviously, my family situation. I've only known Sarah for about 7 years, and we've been married. We'll be married 7 years later this year. And so I always joke with Vanessa that I've known Chloe Joe longer than I've known her. I remember when Chloe Joe was born. But the point that I'm saying is I look up to Russ because he's always been that guy. He did and has had to deal with some hard things. And so I'm like, well, if there's someone that's dealing with some hard things, let me call Russ. And so as Christians, there's nothing wrong with finding someone that, hey, you've been through this. You've been a Christian. How did you handle these situations? Paul, when he was writing to Titus, he would say, have the older women teach the younger women. Why is that? Because there's something that those ladies know. There's something that those ladies have been through that they can teach the younger ones. He says, likewise, men, the older men teach the younger men. Why? Because there's things that older guys know from experience that younger guys don't have to. And that's what you see here. Elisha's like, no, Elijah, I don't want to leave you. And so it happens when they go to Bethel, verse number 2. In verse number 3, it happens when they're going to go to Jericho. In verse number 4 and verse number 5. And so all this time until you finally get down to about verse number 11, and it came to pass as they still went on that they talked, that behold, there appeared a chariot of fire and horses of fire, and parted them both asunder, and Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof. And he saw him no more, and took hold of his own clothes, and rent them in 2 pieces. And he took also up the mantle of Elijah that fell from him, and went back and stood by the bank of Jordan. One of the things that older men and women in the church need to be doing, they need to be doing that mentor role so the next generation can take up that mantle and keep fighting the good fight of faith. There's a scary passage when you think about it over in the book of Judges. Judges chapter 2 and verse number 10 is actually, when you think about it, really a summary of that entire book. But it says, there rose up a generation that knew not the Lord, nor the works which he had done for Israel. And so all it took was for one generation to pass by, and then you have a generation that doesn't know who God is. That's the same in the church. It takes one generation to neglect their responsibility for the next generation to not even know who God is. And sadly, you look at the church right now, and there is a generational gap. Because there was a generation that didn't know God. Now, that's a twofold problem. Problem number 1, why is it that a generation is going to rise up that doesn't know God? What would be a logical reason for that, you think? My mind goes to teaching. If proper teaching was going on, they would know who God is. But also just having to have a proper attitude. And so it's partly the previous generation's fault because they didn't teach, but it's also the current generation's fault because maybe they're not interested. Maybe they are into something else. And sadly, oftentimes, one generation encourages the other generation to not be faithful. You know, I heard someone say, you drive by a ball field where there's a bunch of little league kids playing t-ball or soccer or whatever the case is on Sunday morning. He said, there's a bunch of innocent people out on the field, but there's a bunch of heathens in the stands. Those kids that are out there on the ball field, they don't know better. It's those that are in the stands that are responsible for teaching them. Probably told this story before, but it's one that I think about often. The congregation that I was at before I came here, small little town, it just happened to be the town that I went to high school in. And so I knew everybody. I had known them for years, grown up with them. There was a lady and her husband in that particular congregation. She had two boys. One boy was my brother's age, another boy was my age. I went to high school with them. And when we were in high school, anytime there was a sporting event, anytime there was any type of extracurricular activity, that's where those kids were, and that's where those parents were. That mother came up to me when I was preaching there. She was in tears. Tears. She said, Zach, I have lost my boys. Can you help me get them back? Now, I wish I could stand here and tell you that we had some Bible studies and those boys were restored, but that's not the case. God and godly things were not important to mom and dad, and therefore they were not important to the children. So if you're here this evening and you have a child, make sure you show them what is important to you. Because when they grow up, that's what will be important to them. And so here, Elijah has showed Elisha what matters. And we need to focus on those things. I have a whole lot of other things that we could say, but clearly we don't have time. I want to thank you so much for being here. It would encourage you to be here tomorrow night if you can, as we look at God is bigger than our thoughts. Thank you.